Sometimes the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally are the ones who shatter you into a million pieces. My name is Elena Rodriguez, and on what should have been the happiest night of my 22nd birthday, I discovered that my entire life had been built on a foundation of lies, resentment, and a secret so devastating that it would change everything I thought I knew about myself and my family. This is the story of how one poisoned glass of champagne didn't destroy me, it set me free.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My life in Millbrook, Connecticut had always felt like living inside a snow globe, beautiful from the outside, but ultimately contained and artificial. The Rodriguez family appeared perfect to everyone in our affluent suburb. My father, Dr. Marcus Rodriguez, was the town's most respected cardiologist, and my mother, Patricia, ran the local art gallery while volunteering for every charity event that mattered. Their daughter, me, was supposed to be the crowning achievement of their carefully curated life. Growing up in our sprawling colonial house on Maple Ridge Drive, I was surrounded by every privilege money could buy. Piano lessons, horseback riding, private tutoring, designer clothes. Nothing was too expensive for the Rodriguez family image. Yet despite all the material abundance, I'd always felt like something was missing. Like there was an invisible wall between me and my parents that I could never quite breach. My childhood memories were filled with moments that should have been warm, but somehow felt cold. When I won the state science fair in 8th grade, my mother's congratulations felt rehearsed. When I made varsity tennis as a sophomore, my father's proud smile never quite reached his eyes. It was as if they were playing the roles of loving parents rather than actually being them. I compensated by becoming the perfect daughter they seemed to want. I maintained a 4.0 GPA throughout high school, volunteered at the local hospital, and never gave them a moment's trouble. I thought if I could just be good enough, smart enough, accomplished enough, I would finally break through that invisible barrier and feel truly loved. College at Yale was supposed to be my escape, my chance to discover who I was beyond my parents' expectations. I threw myself into pre-med studies, convinced that following in my father's footsteps would finally earn his genuine approval. But even there, hundreds of miles away, I carried that same hollow feeling, like I was performing my life rather than living it. During my junior year, I started dating James Mitchell, a kind and genuine guy from my organic chemistry class. James came from a warm, boisterous family in Ohio, the kind where everyone talked over each other at dinner, where hugs were frequent and unforced, where love was expressed through actions rather than expensive gifts. Spending holidays with the Mitchells was a revelation. I had never experienced such unconditional acceptance, and it made the emotional distance in my own family even more apparent. James often commented on how formal my relationship with my parents seemed. "It's like you're all business associates rather than family," he'd say after our stilted video calls. I would laugh it off, making excuses about them being busy professionals, but deep down, I knew he was right. There was something fundamentally different about the way my parents related to me compared to how other families interacted. The summer before my senior year, I came home to Millbrook with a renewed determination to bridge that gap with my parents. I convinced myself that maybe I had been imagining things, that perhaps they just expressed love differently. I threw myself into helping my mother at the gallery, accompanying my father to medical conferences, and trying to create the kind of meaningful connections I had witnessed in James's family. But the harder I tried, the more I noticed subtle signs that something was off. Conversations would stop when I entered a room. My parents would exchange meaningful glances that excluded me entirely. Old family friends would look at me with expressions I couldn't quite decipher, something between pity and discomfort. When I asked about my baby photos, my mother would quickly change the subject. When I inquired about our family medical history for a genetics class, my father became unusually evasive. The most telling incident happened in late July. I was helping my mother organize files in her home office when I accidentally knocked over a box of old documents. As papers scattered across the floor, I glimpsed what appeared to be legal documents with my name on them. But before I could examine them closely, my mother swooped in with an almost frantic energy, gathering everything up and shooing me out of the room. "Just old tax papers," she said, but her voice carried a tremor I had never heard before. That night, I lay awake thinking about all the small inconsistencies I had noticed over the years. The way my parents never talked about my birth, how I looked nothing like either of them, despite their dark hair and brown eyes contrasting with my lighter coloring. The absence of any maternal relatives on my mother's side. The way certain topics would cause an awkward silence to fall over family gatherings. I started paying closer attention to the dynamics in our house. I noticed how my parents seemed more relaxed when I wasn't around, how their conversation flowed more naturally when they thought I was out of earshot. I observed how they interacted with my cousin Sarah during family gatherings, the easy affection, the natural banter that never seemed to exist between them and me. As my 22nd birthday approached, I found myself oscillating between hope and anxiety. Maybe this would be the year things changed. Maybe this milestone birthday would somehow unlock the warmth and connection I had always craved. I threw myself into planning what I hoped would be a perfect evening. Just the three of us at Chez Laurent, the upscale French restaurant where we had celebrated every important family occasion. I spent weeks choosing the perfect dress, a midnight blue silk number that brought out my eyes. I made dinner reservations well in advance, requested our usual corner table, even selected the wine I hoped we would share, a bottle of Dom Perignon that seemed appropriately celebratory. This was going to be different. This was going to be the night we finally connected as a real family. Looking back now, I realize how naive I was to think that one dinner could bridge 22 years of emotional distance. I had no idea that instead of bringing us closer together, this birthday celebration would reveal a truth so shocking that it would shatter not only my relationship with my parents, but my understanding of my entire identity. As I got ready that evening, carefully applying my makeup and styling my hair, I caught my reflection in my bedroom mirror. I looked like a young woman ready to celebrate, full of hope and anticipation. I had no idea that in just a few hours, that hopeful young woman would cease to exist, replaced by someone who finally understood why she had never felt like she truly belonged in the beautiful house on Maple Ridge Drive. The stage was set for what I expected to be a memorable birthday dinner. What I got instead was a night that would change everything I thought I knew about love, family, and myself. Sometimes the most devastating truths come wrapped in the most ordinary moments, and sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones holding the knife.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The evening of my 22nd birthday started with an ominous sign that I completely ignored. As I was putting on my earrings, the clasp broke on my grandmother's pearl necklace, the only piece of jewelry I owned that had any sentimental value. The pearls scattered across my hardwood floor like tiny white tears, and as I scrambled to collect them, I should have recognized it as a harbinger of what was to come. I arrived at Chez Laurent 15 minutes early, hoping to ensure everything was perfect. The maitre, Philippe, greeted me with his usual warm smile. "Mademoiselle Rodriguez, happy birthday! Your parents called ahead. They've ordered champagne for the table." My heart lifted. This was exactly the kind of thoughtful gesture that gave me hope for the evening ahead. The restaurant was elegant as always, with soft lighting that cast a golden glow over the white tablecloths and fresh orchids. I had always loved this place because it felt sophisticated and special, the kind of establishment where important family moments should unfold. Our corner table overlooked the small garden patio, and I could see couples dining by candlelight through the French doors. My parents arrived precisely on time. Punctuality was another Rodriguez family trait. My mother looked stunning in a black cocktail dress, her dark hair pulled back in an elegant chignon. My father wore his best navy suit, the one he reserved for hospital board meetings and special occasions. They looked like the perfect power couple they had always been, and for a moment, I felt proud to be their daughter. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," my mother said, kissing my cheek with the kind of careful precision that wouldn't disturb her lipstick. My father handed me a small wrapped box, Tiffany blue, which immediately raised my expectations. "Thank you for choosing this place," my father said as we settled into our seats. "It's always been special for our family." The waiter appeared with the champagne my parents had ordered, Dom Perignon, the same bottle I had hoped we would share. My mother smiled. We thought tonight deserved the best. She seemed unusually animated, almost excited, which was so rare that it filled me with optimism. As we perused our menus, the conversation flowed more easily than it had in months. My father asked about my senior thesis on cardiac genetic disorders, and for once he seemed genuinely interested, rather than just politely attentive. My mother shared gossip about the latest exhibit at her gallery, including me in the kind of insider information she usually kept to herself. "I have some news," I said, deciding this was the perfect moment to share what I'd been saving for tonight. "Professor Williams recommended me for the research program at Johns Hopkins. If I get accepted, I could start working in their cardiology department right after graduation." My parents exchanged one of their looks, but this time it didn't feel exclusionary. It seemed more like surprise, perhaps even pride. "That's wonderful, Elena," my mother said. "Your father and I are so pleased with how focused you've become on your career." The way she said it struck me as odd. Pleased with how focused I've become, as if my dedication to medicine was somehow unexpected or recent. But I pushed the thought aside. Tonight was about connection, not analysis. When our appetizers arrived, my father raised his champagne flute. "To Elena on her 22nd birthday. You've grown into a remarkable young woman." The words were right, but something in his tone made them sound rehearsed, as if he were giving a toast to a colleague's daughter rather than his own child. We drank, and I noticed the champagne tasted slightly bitter, different from what I remembered from previous celebrations. But expensive champagne could be complex, I reasoned, and perhaps my palate had changed since college. The conversation continued, covering safe topics, my studies, their work, plans for the upcoming holidays, but underneath the pleasant small talk, I began to sense an undercurrent of tension, like a low-frequency hum that you feel more than hear. My parents kept looking at each other in a way that suggested they were communicating silently, sharing some knowledge that I wasn't privy to. Midway through our main course, I had ordered the salmon, my mother the duck, my father his usual filet mignon. My mother excused herself to the ladies' room. She was gone longer than necessary, and when she returned, her expression had changed. She looked resolved, almost determined, as if she had given herself a pep talk in the mirror.
"Elena," she said, settling back into her chair, "your father and I have been discussing something important, and we think tonight is the right time to address it." My stomach clenched. In my family, discussions about important matters never led anywhere good. But I forced a smile. "What's that?" My father leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped in front of him in the way he positioned them when delivering difficult news to patients' families. "We've been thinking about your future, about the choices you're making, and we believe it's time for some honesty." The word honesty hung in the air like a challenge. What had I been dishonest about? My grades were excellent. I wasn't dating anyone questionable. I hadn't asked for money or gotten into any trouble. I racked my brain trying to think of what transgression they might have discovered. "We know about James," my mother said quietly. Relief flooded through me.
James? What about him? I've never hidden our relationship. No, my father agreed, but you've been more serious about him than you've let on. We've heard from the Mitchells about holiday visits, about how close you've become to their family. I felt confused. Why would my relationship with James's family be a problem? They were wonderful people, warm, genuine, everything I had always wished my own family could be. I don't understand. The Mitchells have been incredibly welcoming. I thought you'd be happy that I found people who care about me. My parents exchanged another look, and this one was definitely loaded with meaning I couldn't decipher. That's exactly the problem, my mother said softly. You've become too attached to the idea of that kind of family dynamic. You're comparing us to them, and it's creating unrealistic expectations. The champagne was making me feel slightly lightheaded, and my parents' words weren't making sense. Unrealistic expectations of what? Of what this family can be. Elena, you've always been a dreamer, always wanting more emotion, more connection than some families naturally provide. We've tried to give you everything you could possibly need. I'm not asking for more than other families provide, I protested, my voice rising slightly. I'm asking for what every family should have. Genuine affection, real conversations, the feeling that I actually belong here. The silence that followed my words was deafening. Other diners continued their conversations around us. Wine glasses clinked, the soft jazz continued to play, but at our table, time seemed suspended. Finally, my mother spoke, her voice so quiet I had to lean forward to hear her. What if I told you that belonging isn't always a given? What if I told you that some family connections are different than others? What do you mean, different? I asked, though something deep in my stomach told me I didn't want to know the answer. My father reached across the table and refilled my champagne glass, even though I had barely touched it. Drink up, sweetheart. This conversation requires a certain level of openness. I looked down at the golden liquid in my glass, then back at my parents' faces. For the first time in my life, I saw something in their expressions that chilled me to the bone. It wasn't love, not even the detached affection I had grown accustomed to. It was something calculating, almost clinical. What aren't you telling me? I whispered. My mother reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope, thick, cream-colored paper that looked official. She placed it on the table between us, like a weapon. Elena, she said, there are things about your birth, about your place in this family that you need to understand. And after tonight, everything is going to be different. The champagne glass trembled in my hand as I realized that whatever was in that envelope was about to shatter the carefully constructed world I had lived in for 22 years. The catalyst I had been waiting for my entire life wasn't going to bring my family closer together. It was going to tear everything apart.
The envelope sat between us like a live grenade, its cream-colored surface reflecting the restaurant's soft lighting. My hand shook as I reached for it, but something primal in my brain screamed at me to stop. Whatever was inside that envelope would change everything, and despite years of feeling disconnected from my parents, I suddenly wanted to preserve the illusion of our family, broken as it was. I don't want to read this, I whispered, pulling my hand back. Not here, not tonight. This is supposed to be my birthday celebration. My father's expression remained eerily calm. Elena, you're 22 years old. You're an adult. It's time you knew the truth about your situation.
My situation. The words felt foreign on my tongue. What situation? I'm your daughter. This is my family. What situation could there possibly be? My mother leaned forward and I caught a whiff of her perfume mixed with something else, wine on her breath, which was unusual because she rarely drank more than a single glass. Sweetheart, you've always been so intelligent, so perceptive. Haven't you ever wondered why things felt different with us? The champagne was making my thoughts fuzzy, but her question hit like a physical blow. Of course I had wondered. I had wondered every single day of my life why I felt like an outsider in my own home, why affection felt rationed, why love seemed conditional on my achievements rather than my existence. Every family is different, I said defensively. Just because we're not as demonstrative as some families doesn't mean there's something wrong. Look at me, Elena, my father said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used with difficult patience. Really look at me. Against my better judgment, I met his eyes. They were brown, almost black, set in a face with strong Spanish features inherited from his Mexican grandparents. I glanced at my mother. Dark hair, olive skin, brown eyes that could trace their lineage back to her Italian grandmother. Then I thought about my own reflection. Light brown hair with natural blonde highlights, green eyes, fair skin that burned rather than tanned. Genetics can be unpredictable, I said, but my voice lacked conviction. I had taken enough biology courses to know that two dark-eyed parents producing a green-eyed child was possible, but statistically unlikely. Elena, my mother said gently, do you remember asking about your baby pictures? I did remember. Every time I had asked to see photos from my first year of life, the conversation would somehow get redirected. When I pressed the issue, my mother would claim they were stored somewhere inaccessible or that she was waiting for the right time to go through old memories. They were in storage, I mumbled. They don't exist, my father said bluntly. At least, not in the way you think they should. The restaurant suddenly felt suffocating. The soft jazz that had seemed elegant earlier now sounded discordant, and the warm lighting felt harsh against my increasingly pale skin. What do you mean they don't exist? My mother's hand moved toward the envelope again. Elena, you need to understand that when your father and I got married, we tried for years to have a biological child. We went through fertility treatments, multiple miscarriages, years of disappointment and grief. So, you adopted me, I said, the pieces finally clicking into place. Relief flooded through me. That's what this is about. You're finally telling me I'm adopted. The adoption revelation actually made sense, and in some ways it was comforting. It would explain the physical differences, the emotional distance, the feeling that I had never quite fit in. Many adoptive families were loving and close. Maybe my parents had just struggled with how to navigate those relationships. But instead of relief or confirmation on their faces, I saw something much more complex. My father looked almost disappointed. My mother appeared to be steeling herself for something even more difficult. It's more complicated than that, my mother said quietly. How could it be more complicated? Either you adopted me or you didn't. My father signaled the waiter for another bottle of champagne, even though we had barely made a dent in the first one. The delay while we waited for the new bottle felt eternal, and I found myself studying my parents' faces, looking for any sign of the warmth and relief that should accompany finally sharing a family secret.
Instead, I saw calculation. Elena, my father began when the waiter had left, adoption typically involves agencies, background checks, legal processes designed to ensure the best interests of the child. Typically, the word hung between us like a trap. My mother opened the envelope with deliberate slowness, as if she were performing a ritual she had rehearsed many times. She pulled out several documents. Some looked official, others appeared to be handwritten notes or letters. Your biological mother was 17 years old, she said, her voice clinical and detached. She was unmarried, from a troubled family, with no resources and no support system. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the restaurant's air conditioning. Okay, that's not uncommon for birth mothers. Lots of teenagers place children for adoption. She didn't place you for adoption, Elena. My father's words were delivered like a medical diagnosis. She never signed official papers. She never went through an agency. The champagne glass slipped from my fingers, and I watched in slow motion as Dom Perignon splashed across the white tablecloth. What are you saying? We're saying, my mother continued, laying out documents I couldn't quite focus on, that your birth mother was desperate, broke, and alone, and we were desperate for a child. We made an arrangement. An arrangement? I repeated the words, but they felt meaningless, like sounds in a foreign language. We paid her, my father said. We paid her medical expenses, gave her money for afterward, and took you home from the hospital. No agencies, no official adoption process, no legal complications. The room was spinning now, and I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. That's not legal. You can't just buy a baby. It wasn't technically buying, my mother corrected, as if the distinction mattered. It was a private arrangement. Happens more often than you might think, especially in situations where official channels would be problematic. Problematic how? My parents exchanged another one of their loaded looks, and I realized there was still more. Whatever they had told me so far was just the beginning. Elena, my father said, his voice surprisingly gentle given the brutality of his words, your birth mother wasn't just young and broke. She had other issues. Drug problems, legal troubles, family dysfunction that went back generations. So you rescued me, I said desperately, trying to find some way to frame the story that didn't make my parents sound like the villains. You took me away from a bad situation and gave me a better life. We gave you what we could, but Elena, you have to understand, this arrangement, this situation, it was never supposed to be permanent. The words hit me like a physical blow. What do you mean, not permanent? We mean, my father said, reaching for the second bottle of champagne and refilling my glass despite my obvious distress, that you were never supposed to become attached, and we were never supposed to become attached to you. I stared at him, trying to process what he had just said. I don't understand. You raised me. I've lived here for 22 years. How could that not be permanent? Because, my mother said, pulling out another document from the envelope, the arrangement included a provision that once you turned 22 and finished college, you would be transitioned out of our lives. The restaurant noise faded to a dull buzz. Transitioned out? Elena, my father said, his voice surprisingly gentle given the brutality of his words, you were never really our daughter. You were a temporary solution to our childlessness, a way for us to experience parenting without the permanent commitment. I felt like I was drowning. That's impossible. You can't raise a child for 22 years as a temporary arrangement. We can, my mother said simply. And we did. The champagne in my glass looked different now, more darker. I pushed it away, suddenly understanding why I had been feeling so disoriented. You put something in my drink. Just something to help you stay calm. We knew this conversation would be difficult. I tried to stand, but my legs felt unsteady. The room was tilting, and my parents' faces seemed to be shifting and blurring. You drugged me. At my birthday dinner, you drugged me? Elena, please sit down. We have more to tell you, and you need to hear all of it. But I didn't want to hear anymore. I didn't want to know what other revelations were waiting in that envelope. I wanted to run, to escape, to wake up and discover this was all a nightmare. I won't listen to any more of this, I said, gripping the table as I struggled to my feet. This is insane. This can't be real. Elena, my father said firmly, you need to sit down and finish this conversation. After tonight, everything changes. You need to understand what happens next. But I was already reaching for my purse, already stumbling toward the restaurant's exit, already running from a truth that was more devastating than I could have imagined.
I made it exactly 3 blocks from Chez Laurent before the combination of shock, champagne, and whatever they had put in my drink forced me to collapse onto a bench outside the Millbrook Public Library. The irony wasn't lost on me. Seeking refuge at the place where I had spent countless childhood afternoons reading fairy tales about orphaned children who found their true families. Except in my story, I had just discovered that my true family had never wanted me at all. My phone buzzed incessantly with calls from my parents, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. Each ring felt like another betrayal, another reminder that the people I had trusted most in the world had been living a lie for my entire existence. When the calls finally stopped, a text message appeared from my mother. Elena, come home. There's more you need to understand. This doesn't have to end badly. End badly? What could be worse than learning that your entire life was a temporary business arrangement? The October night air was crisp, and I realized I had left my coat at the restaurant in my desperate escape. But the cold felt appropriate somehow. It matched the numbness spreading through my chest as I tried to process what I had learned. 22 years of birthdays, Christmases, graduations, and family photos had all been performance art by people who were counting down the days until they could discard me. A police car slowed as it passed, and I realized how I must look. A young woman in a cocktail dress, sitting alone on a public bench at night, clearly distressed. I forced myself to sit up straighter, to arrange my face into something resembling composure. The last thing I needed to do was be taken home to my parents by well-meaning officers who had no idea they'd be delivering me back to my captors. As the cruiser continued down the street, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts. Who could I call? Who in my life was real? James was in Ohio visiting his family, and involving him would mean explaining something I didn't even understand myself. My college friends were scattered across the country for fall break. The neighbors who had watched me grow up now seemed like strangers who had been part of an elaborate deception. Then I remembered Mrs. Chen. Mrs. Chen had been our housekeeper for over 15 years, coming twice a week to clean and occasionally staying to cook dinner when my parents worked late. She was the closest thing to maternal warmth I had experienced in my own home, always asking about my day, remembering my favorite foods, treating me with genuine kindness rather than obligation. If anyone might have insights into my family's secrets, it would be her. I dialed her number, praying she would answer despite the late hour. Elena, is everything okay, sweetheart? Her voice was heavy with sleep, but immediately concerned. Mrs. Chen, I need you to be completely honest with me. Did you know about me, about how I came to live with the Rodriguez family? The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, she spoke, her voice careful and sad. Oh, Elena, they told you tonight, didn't they? The confirmation hit me like a physical blow. You knew. All these years, you knew what they were planning? I knew something wasn't right. The way they talked about you when they thought no one was listening, the legal papers I sometimes saw, the way they never seemed to bond with you the way parents should. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you say something? Elena, I'm an immigrant woman who cleans houses for wealthy families. Who was going to believe me? And what could I have done?
called child services and claim that parents who provided you with everything were somehow mistreating you? You were fed, clothed, educated, given every advantage. She was right, and her honesty stung because it highlighted how carefully orchestrated my parents' deception had been. From the outside, I was the luckiest child in Millbrook, privileged, successful, seemingly loved. Mrs. Chen, they said tonight was about ending things. Do you know what that means? Another long pause. Elena, where are you right now? Are you safe? I'm at the library downtown. I couldn't go home after they told me. Listen to me carefully, she said, her voice taking on an urgency I had never heard before. You need to go back home tonight. You need to hear everything they have to say, because whatever they're planning, you need to understand it fully before you can decide how to fight it.
Fight it? Mrs. Chen, what aren't you telling me? Elena, there were phone calls over the past few weeks, conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, papers being signed. I think they've been preparing for this moment for a long time. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the October air. Preparing how? I don't know exactly, but Elena, you need to know that your parents aren't evil people. They're just broken in ways that made them incapable of real love. But that doesn't mean you have to let them destroy you. How can I go back there? How can I sit in that house knowing what I know now? Because, Mrs. Chen said firmly, you're stronger than they are. You always have been. You survived 22 years of emotional starvation and still became a kind, intelligent, accomplished woman. They couldn't break your spirit when they had complete control over you. They certainly can't break it now. Her words sparked something in me. Not quite hope, but something harder and more determined. Anger. Mrs. Chen, if I go back there tonight, will you come over? I don't think I can face them alone. I'll be there in 30 minutes, she said without hesitation. And Elena, whatever they tell you tonight, remember that their version of your story doesn't define who you are. You get to decide what happens next. I hung up and sat on the bench for a few more minutes, watching the last few cars drive down Millbrook's quiet Mean Street. Normal people, going home to normal families after normal evenings. I envied them, their ordinary problems, their uncomplicated relationships, their certainty about who they were and where they belonged. But Mrs. Chen was right. I needed to know everything before I could plan my next move. Whatever my parents had in store for me, whatever documents were in that envelope, whatever ending they had orchestrated, I needed to understand the full scope of their betrayal before I could figure out how to escape it. As I stood up from the bench, I noticed that the dizziness from whatever they had given me was starting to fade. My thoughts were becoming clearer, sharper. The shock was transforming into something more useful, determination. I walked back toward Maple Ridge Drive, each step feeling like a small act of rebellion. My parents thought they could control this narrative, could manage my reaction, could orchestrate my exit from their lives as efficiently as they had managed everything else about my existence. They had drugged me to keep me compliant, revealed their secrets in a public place to prevent me from making a scene, and probably expected me to come home grateful for the life they had provided and ready to transition quietly out of their world. But they made a crucial miscalculation. They raised me to be intelligent, independent, and resilient. They educated me, given me skills, taught me to think critically and solve problems. In trying to create the perfect temporary daughter, they had accidentally created someone capable of fighting back. As I turned onto Maple Ridge Drive, I saw Mrs. Chen's car already parked in our driveway. The house blazed with lights, every window glowing as if my parents were preparing for something important, which I suppose they were. Tonight was supposed to be the end of my story with the Rodriguez family. They had planned it as a conclusion, a final chapter that would allow them to close the book on their 22-year experiment in parenthood.
But as I walked up the front steps of the house where I had spent my entire life, I made a decision that would change everything. Tonight wouldn't be the end of my story. Tonight would be the beginning of my real life. I was done being their victim. I was done accepting scraps of affection and pretending they constituted love. I was done living in their carefully constructed lie. Whatever they had planned for me, whatever documents waited in that envelope, whatever ending they had orchestrated, I was going to take control of my own narrative. I reached for the front door handle, took a deep breath, and prepared to walk back into the house, not as their grateful, compliant, temporary daughter, but as a woman ready to fight for her own future.
Walking back into the house felt like entering enemy territory. The familiar scent of my mother's jasmine candles and the sound of classical music playing softly from the living room, details that had once meant home, now felt like props and an elaborate stage set designed to deceive me. Mrs. Chen met me at the door, her usually calm demeanor replaced by protective alertness, like a guard dog ready to defend her charge. "They're in the study," she whispered, taking my hands in hers. Her touch was warm and real, the first genuine human contact I'd felt since this nightmare began. "Elena, before you go in there, you need to know something. I've been working for families like yours for 20 years. Rich people have different rules, different ways of handling problems. What they're about to tell you, it's not going to be the end of their plans. It's going to be the beginning." My parents were indeed in the study, sitting in the leather chairs where they usually discussed household finances and social obligations. The envelope from the restaurant lay open on the coffee table, its contents spread out like evidence at a crime scene. Additional documents I hadn't seen before were arranged in neat piles: legal papers, financial statements, and what appeared to be correspondence. "Elena," my father said as I entered, his voice carefully modulated to sound reasonable and concerned, "we're glad you came back. We were worried about you." "Worried about me?" I remained standing, unwilling to sit and make myself smaller in their presence. "Or worried that I might tell someone what you just confessed to?" My mother gestured to the chair across from them. "Please sit down. There's more you need to understand about your situation and some decisions that need to be made." "My situation," I repeated, the clinical phrase making my skin crawl. "Is that what you've called me for 22 years? Your situation?" "Elena," my father said, falling back into his professional persona, "emotion isn't going to help anyone right now. We need to discuss practical matters." Mrs. Chen positioned herself near the doorway, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough away to avoid immediate confrontation. Her presence gave me strength, a reminder that not everyone in my life had been living a lie. I sat down, but perched on the edge of the chair, ready to flee if necessary. "What practical matters?" My mother picked up a thick legal document from the coffee table. "Elena, when we made the arrangement for you to come live with us, it wasn't just an informal agreement. There were contracts involved. Legal protections for all parties." "All parties," I said flatly. "You mean you, my birth mother, and me, the commodity being traded." "You weren't a commodity," my father said, though his tone suggested he was reading from a script he'd rehearsed. "You were a child who needed care, and we were people who could provide that care temporarily." "Temporarily," I echoed. "Keep using that word. Maybe eventually it will make sense." My mother opened the legal document and began reading in the same voice she used for gallery contracts and charity board presentations. The agreement stipulated that the child would be provided with housing, education, medical care, and reasonable comfort until reaching the age of 22 or completion of undergraduate education, whichever came later. "Reasonable comfort," I interrupted. "Is that what you called the emotional distance? The conditional love? The feeling that I was always auditioning for my place in this family?" "Elena, please let me finish," my mother continued. "Upon reaching the specified age and educational milestone, the arrangement would conclude with the transition period of no more than 6 months, during which the child would be expected to establish independent living arrangements." Expected by whom? Who wrote these rules? By all parties involved, my father said, including your birth mother. The room started spinning again, and I gripped the chair arms to steady myself. My birth mother is still alive? Of course she's alive, my mother said, as if this should have been obvious. Elena, you're 22 years old. Your birth mother is only 39. The math hit me like a physical blow. Somewhere out there was a woman who had given birth to me at 17 and had been living her life for 22 years knowing exactly where I was and what had happened to me. Does she know about tonight? About what you're telling me? My parents exchanged one of their loaded glances, and I realized this was where the story took another devastating turn. She knows, my father said carefully, because she's been in communication with us throughout your life. Communication how? I demanded. My mother pulled out another set of documents. These looked like letters, handwritten pages that had been photocopied and filed. She's written to us regularly. Birthday cards, Christmas notes, updates about her life. And we've sent her information about you. Report cards, school photos, achievement awards. I stared at the papers, trying to process this new layer of betrayal. You've been corresponding with my birth mother for 22 years, and you never told me? It wasn't part of the arrangement, my father explained. The agreement stipulated that direct contact between you and your birth mother would be prohibited until the conclusion of the care period.
The conclusion of the care period, I repeated slowly. You mean now? Exactly, my mother said, pulling out what appeared to be a plane ticket. Elena, your birth mother, her name is Sarah Caldwell, lives in Portland, Oregon. She's married now, has 2 children, and has built a stable life. She's expecting you. The plane ticket lay on the coffee table like a trap. I could see my name printed on it, Elena Rodriguez, with a departure date just 3 days away. You bought me a plane ticket to meet a stranger and expect me to just go? She's not a stranger, my mother corrected. She's your biological mother. And according to the original agreement, she's been preparing for your return since the day you left. My return? The words felt absurd. I was a baby. I didn't leave anywhere. I was taken. You were placed, my father said firmly, temporarily placed with us for care and education. Now that placement is ending, and you're being reunited with your biological family. Mrs. Chen cleared her throat from the doorway. Excuse me, but may I ask a question? Her voice was polite but steel-edged. What happens if Elena doesn't want to go to Portland? What if she wants to stay here and maintain the only family relationships she's ever known? My parents' masks slipped for just a moment, and I saw something ugly underneath, relief that someone had asked the question they didn't want to address. That's not really an option, my mother said. Elena, you have to understand, we fulfilled our obligations under the agreement. We've provided for you, educated you, prepared you for independent life, but the arrangement has reached its natural conclusion. Natural conclusion? I stood up, anger finally overriding shock. There's nothing natural about this. You can't just raise a child for 22 years and then ship her off to strangers because your contract expired. Elena, please lower your voice, my father said, glancing nervously toward the windows. The neighbors don't need to hear family business. Family business? I laughed, a sound with no humor in it. We're not a family. You just explained that in excruciating detail. We're business associates whose contract is up for renewal, and you've decided not to renew it. Mrs. Chen stepped forward. Elena, sit down. Let them finish explaining their plan. You need to know everything before you can figure out how to fight it. I sat back down, but everything in my body was coiled for action. What else? My mother pulled out financial documents. Elena, we've prepared a transition fund for you, $50,000 to help you establish yourself independently. $50,000? I stared at the check she placed on the table. That's what 22 years of my life is worth to you? It's more than the original agreement required, my father said defensively. We've exceeded our obligations in multiple ways. Exceeded your obligations?
I repeated. You mean like caring about me? Like loving me? Like treating me as if I were actually your daughter instead of a long-term house guest? Elena, my mother said, her patience clearly wearing thin, you're being emotional and unrealistic. We provided you with every advantage, every opportunity. Most children would be grateful for the life you've had. Grateful? I stood up again, this time moving toward the documents spread across the coffee table. You want me to be grateful that you've spent my entire life lying to me? Grateful that you've treated me like a business arrangement? Grateful that you've been counting down the days until you could get rid of me? I reached for the plane ticket, then stopped. What happens if I refuse to go? What if I tear up this ticket and refuse to participate in your plan? The silence that followed my question was deafening. My parents looked at each other, and for the first time all evening, they seemed genuinely uncertain. Finally, my father spoke, his voice carefully controlled. Elena, I think you're underestimating how little choice you have in this matter. What do you mean? My mother picked up another document I hadn't noticed before. Elena, legally speaking, you're not our daughter. You never were. You're an adult who has been living in our home, and we're no longer willing to provide that housing. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. You're evicting me. We're concluding our arrangement, my father corrected. The transition fund and the plane ticket are generous offerings to help you reconnect with your biological family. But Elena, you need to understand, after this weekend, you can't continue living here. I looked around the study at the bookshelves where I'd done homework for 12 years, at the family photos that apparently documented a lie, at the furniture that never really been mine to enjoy. So my choices are to go to Portland, to meet strangers who gave me away, or become homeless. Those aren't your only choices, Mrs. Chen said quietly from the doorway, but you need to think carefully about your next steps. I realized this was my first real test of independence. Everything I had learned about problem solving, about resilience, about standing up for myself, it all came down to this moment. My parents had given me an ultimatum disguised as options, but they had also underestimated the person they had inadvertently raised me to become. I was about to show them exactly how wrong they were about who held the power in this situation.
The next morning, I woke up in what I now understood was a guest room in someone else's house. Every familiar object, my Yale pennant, my collection of science textbooks, the jewelry box that had belonged to my supposed grandmother, felt like evidence of a life that had never really been mine. Mrs. Chen had stayed overnight, sleeping in the living room like a guard protecting a prisoner, and her presence was the only thing that felt real in a world that had become completely untethered. I had spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, trying to formulate a plan, but every potential solution led to dead ends. I had no legal standing in the house where I'd lived my entire life. I had no family connections beyond the people who wanted me gone, and a stranger in Portland, Ohio, who had been waiting 22 years for my arrival. My bank account contained the money I'd earned from work-study jobs and summer internships, maybe $8,000 total. Not enough to rent an apartment, certainly not enough to finish my senior year at Yale without the financial support my parents had always provided. The cruel genius of their plan was becoming clear. They hadn't just raised me temporarily, they had raised me dependently. Every aspect of my life, my education, my living situation, my financial security, was tied to their continued support. They had created a situation where rejecting their plan would mean sacrificing everything I had worked for. When I finally dragged myself downstairs, I found my parents in the kitchen, having breakfast and reading the newspaper, as if this were any other Saturday morning. The normalcy of the scene was so jarring that for a moment I wondered if the previous night had been an elaborate nightmare. "Good morning, Elena," my mother said, her voice carefully cheerful. "Mrs. Chen made your favorite pancakes." The domesticity felt like mockery. Mrs. Chen placed a plate in front of me, but the sight of food made my stomach turn. "I'm not hungry." "You need to eat," my father said, not looking up from the business section. "You have a big day ahead of you."
What kind of big day? My mother folded her newspaper precisely and gave me the kind of smile she reserved for difficult gallery clients. We've scheduled a phone call with Sarah, your birth mother, at noon. She's very excited to speak with you. A phone call? I stared at them. You've arranged a phone call with a stranger and expect me to just participate? Elena, my father said, his patience already wearing thin. Sarah isn't a stranger. She's your biological mother, and she's been waiting 22 years for this reunion. The least you can do is speak with her. The least I can do? I stood up, my chair scraping against the kitchen floor. What about what you've done? What about the fact that you've been lying to me my entire life? We provided for you, my mother said, her voice taking on an edge. We gave you everything you could possibly need, except honesty, except love, except the basic human decency of treating me like a person instead of a temporary obligation. Mrs. Chen appeared at my elbow with a cup of coffee, and I could see the worry in her eyes. She had been listening to my parents' conversations, and whatever she had overheard clearly concerned her. Elena, my father said, standing up and assuming his full authority, you're being dramatic and ungrateful. We're trying to handle this transition as smoothly as possible, but your cooperation is required. Required? The word hung in the air like a challenge. What happens if I don't cooperate? What happens if I refuse to talk to Sarah, refuse to take your money, refuse to participate in your plan? The silence that followed was loaded with threat. Elena, my mother said carefully, we've been very generous with our timeline. We've given you 3 days to process this information and prepare for your transition. But that timeline isn't negotiable. And if I don't meet your timeline? My father walked to the kitchen desk and pulled out another set of documents I hadn't seen before. Elena, let me explain something about your legal situation. You're 22 years old, which means you're an adult, but you've never been legally adopted by us, which means you have no claim to anything in this house, no right to continued financial support, and no legal standing to contest our decisions. He spread the new documents across the kitchen counter, like a dealer showing his hand. These are eviction papers. If you choose not to cooperate with the transition plan, we'll be forced to pursue formal eviction proceedings. That process typically takes 30 days, during which you would be allowed to remain in the house. But it would also create a legal record that would follow you for the rest of your life.
I stared at the papers, trying to process this new level of cruelty. You would actually evict me? You would put formal eviction proceedings on my record? Only if you force us to, my mother said. Elena, we're trying to avoid that kind of unpleasantness. The transition plan we've created is designed to help you reconnect with your biological family while maintaining your dignity. My dignity? I laughed, a sound with no humor in it. You think shipping me off to strangers preserves my dignity? Mrs. Chen cleared her throat. Excuse me, but I have a question about these eviction papers. Her voice was calm, but I could hear steel underneath. Have you had these reviewed by an attorney? My parents looked uncomfortable for the first time all morning. We don't need an attorney for straightforward eviction proceedings, my father said. Actually, Mrs. Chen continued, I think you might. Elena has lived here for 22 years. She's received mail here, filed taxes with this address, established residency. Even without adoption papers, she may have tenant rights that complicate your timeline. I looked at Mrs. Chen with new respect. She had been doing research, thinking ahead, preparing for legal complications my parents hadn't considered. That's irrelevant, my mother said quickly. Elena isn't going to force us into legal proceedings. She's going to do the right thing and cooperate with the transition. The right thing, I repeated. According to whom? According to the agreement that's been in place since you were born, my father said. Elena, you seem to think this situation is optional, that you can simply refuse to participate.
But the reality is that your childhood is over, your education is nearly complete, and the arrangement that brought you here has reached its natural conclusion. There's nothing natural about this. Elena, my mother said, her voice taking on the tone she used with particularly difficult artists, your birth mother has built her entire adult life around the expectation of your return. She's married a man who understands the situation, they've prepared their children for your arrival, and she's planned her career around being available for this transition. You can't simply ignore those commitments. I never made those commitments. I was a baby. I didn't agree to any of this. But your birth mother did, my father said, and we did. And the fact that you're now old enough to understand the arrangement doesn't give you the right to unilaterally change it. The kitchen felt like it was closing in on me. Every rational argument I could make was being met with legal technicalities and emotional manipulation. They had spent 22 years preparing for this moment, and I was trying to improvise a response with no resources and no allies except Mrs. Chen. What if I contact a lawyer myself? What if I challenge the legality of this entire arrangement? My parents exchanged a look that made my blood run cold. Elena, my father said slowly, I should mention that the original arrangement with your birth mother wasn't entirely conventional. If you were to involve attorneys, if you were to make this situation public, there could be legal consequences for all parties involved. What kind of legal consequences? The kind that could result in criminal charges related to illegal adoption practices, my mother said quietly. Elena, we've all been living in a legal gray area for 22 years. Bringing outside attention to this situation could destroy not just our lives, but your birth mother's life as well. I felt the trap closing around me. They weren't just threatening to evict me, they were threatening to destroy everyone involved if I fought back. My birth mother, who I didn't even know, could face criminal charges because of an arrangement made when she was 17 and desperate. So my choices are to go quietly to Portland or destroy multiple people's lives by fighting this legally. Your choices, my father corrected, are to move forward in your life in a positive way or to make this situation destructive for everyone involved. I looked around the kitchen, where I had eaten breakfast for thousands of mornings, where Mrs. Chen had taught me to cook, where I had done homework and dreamed about my future. In a few days, I would never see this room again, never sit at this table, never have another moment of the only life I had ever known. But as devastating as that realization was, I was beginning to understand something even more important. My parents had raised me to be intelligent, resourceful, and determined. In trying to create the perfect temporary daughter, they had accidentally given me the tools I would need to survive their betrayal. They thought they held all the cards. They were about to discover how wrong they were. The phone rang, interrupting the tense silence. My mother answered with false cheerfulness. "Hello, Sarah. Yes, she's here. Are you ready to speak with Elena?" My birth mother was on the phone, waiting to talk to the daughter she had given away 22 years ago. In 60 seconds, I would be speaking to the woman who had agreed to this arrangement, who had been counting down the days until my return, who had built her life around my eventual arrival. I realized this conversation would determine not just my immediate future, but who I was going to become. I could be a victim of other people's choices, or I could start taking control of my own story. I reached for the phone, knowing that everything would change the moment I said, "Hello."
Taking the phone felt like grasping a live wire. My hand trembled as I brought it to my ear, acutely aware that my parents were watching my every expression, ready to intervene if the conversation didn't go according to their script. "Hello?" My voice came out smaller than I intended. "Elena?" The voice on the other end was warm, slightly breathless with nervousness, and unmistakably emotional. "Oh my God, Elena, I can't believe I'm finally talking to you." "Hi," I managed, not knowing what else to say to a woman who was both a complete stranger and supposedly my mother. "I'm Sarah," she said, and I could hear tears in her voice. "I've been waiting for this moment for so long. I have so much to tell you, so much to explain." My parents leaned forward, clearly straining to hear both sides of the conversation.
I turned away from them, creating what little privacy I could in the situation. "Sarah," I said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Did you really agree to this arrangement? Did you really want me to come back after 22 years? There was a pause, and when Sarah spoke again, her voice was different, more guarded, less effusive with nervousness. "Elena, the situation when you were born was complicated. I was 17, alone, and I thought I was doing what was best for everyone. That's not what I asked. I asked if you agreed to this arrangement, this plan where I would be raised temporarily and then sent back to you." Another pause, longer this time. "Elena, where are you having this conversation? Are the Rodriguez family listening?" Something in her tone made me alert. "Yes, they're right here. Why?" "Can you go somewhere private? Can you call me back from another phone, maybe from outside the house?" I looked at my parents, who were clearly becoming agitated by the turn the conversation had taken. I'm not sure that's possible right now." "Elena," Sarah said urgently, "listen to me carefully. The story you've been told about our arrangement, it's not complete. There are things you need to know, things I couldn't put in letters because I knew they would read them." My heart started racing. "What things?" "Elena, I never agreed to you coming back to me after 22 years. That was never part of any agreement I signed." The words hit me like a physical blow. I turned to look at my parents, who had gone completely still. "What do you mean?" I whispered into the phone. "I mean," Sarah said, her voice becoming stronger and more determined, "that the Rodriguez family have been lying to both of us. Elena, I gave you up for adoption because I thought you were going to a loving family who wanted a daughter forever. I never agreed to any temporary arrangement." The room started spinning. "But they said they have documents." "Elena, can you get away from them? Can you meet me somewhere? Because I have documents too, and I think you need to see them." My parents were now standing, clearly able to hear enough of the conversation to know it wasn't going according to their plan. "I can't," I said into the phone. "They're not letting me leave." "Not letting you leave?" Sarah's voice sharpened. "Elena, you're 22 years old. They can't keep you prisoner." "Elena," my father interrupted, reaching for the phone, "I think this conversation has gone on long enough." But I stepped back, keeping the phone away from him. "Sarah, quickly, what really happened when I was born?" "I was 17 and scared, and they promised you would have the best life possible with parents who desperately wanted a child. I signed adoption papers, Elena, real adoption papers. You were supposed to be their daughter forever." "Give me the phone, Elena," my mother demanded, her composure finally cracking. "Sarah," I said quickly, "do you have copies of those papers?" "I have everything. Elena, I've been trying to contact you for years, but they told me you didn't want any relationship with me. They said you were happy and well-adjusted, and contact with me would only confuse you." My father made another grab for the phone, but Mrs. Chen suddenly appeared between us, blocking his path. "Let her finish the conversation," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "Sarah," I said, my mind racing, "if you signed adoption papers, if I was supposed to be their daughter forever, then what they're doing now is illegal. Elena, they can't just decide to stop being your parents because you turn 22. Adoption doesn't work that way." I stared at my parents, seeing their carefully constructed lies crumbling in real time. They told me I was never really adopted. They said I was just a temporary arrangement. That's not true. Elena, I have certified copies of the adoption decree. You are legally Elena Rodriguez. You have been since you were 3 months old.
The implications of this revelation hit me like an avalanche. If I was legally adopted, then I wasn't a temporary house guest with no rights. I was their daughter, with all the legal protections that status provided. They couldn't just evict me. They couldn't just end our relationship because their made-up contract had expired. "Elena, hang up the phone now," my father commanded, his voice taking on an authority I had never heard before. But for the first time in my life, I didn't obey him. "Sarah, can you prove what you're telling me?" "I can do better than that. Elena, I'm already on my way to Connecticut. I've been driving since yesterday. I should be there in about 4 hours." "You're coming here?" Elena, when Marcus called me last week to arrange this reunion, something didn't feel right. The way he talked about you, the way he described this transition, it didn't match what I remembered about our agreement. So I did some research, and I discovered some very disturbing things about what's been happening. My parents had gone pale. My mother was gripping the kitchen counter so hard her knuckles were white. What kind of disturbing things? Elena, I think you're in danger. Not physical danger, but legal and financial danger. I think they've been planning to steal your identity, your educational credentials, maybe even money that was meant for you. That's enough, my mother shouted, lunging for the phone. But Mrs. Chen caught her arm. Let the girl hear what her real mother has to say. Sarah, I said quickly, can you contact me when you get here? I'll call Mrs. Chen's number. Elena, I've been researching your family for the past week, and I know Mrs. Chen has been the only person in that house who's treated you with genuine care. I looked at Mrs. Chen, who nodded encouragingly. Elena, one more thing, Sarah said urgently. Whatever they've told you about money, about transition funds, about needing to leave, none of it is true. If you're legally adopted, then you have inheritance rights, you have legal standing, and you have protections they've been hiding from you. Inheritance rights? Elena, your adoptive grandparents, Marcus's parents, left money and trust for their grandchildren. If you're legally adopted, that money belongs to you. I stared at my parents, pieces of a larger puzzle suddenly clicking into place. The urgency of their timeline, the pressure to get me out of the house, the careful legal documents they'd prepared, none of it was about fulfilling an old agreement. It was about stealing money that legally belonged to me. How much money? I whispered. According to my research, about $2 million that becomes accessible when you turn 25 or complete your graduate degree, whichever comes first. The phone clattered to the floor as the full scope of their betrayal hit me. They weren't just trying to get rid of an unwanted temporary daughter. They were trying to steal my inheritance by convincing me I had no legal rights. My parents stood frozen, caught in a lie so enormous that there was no way to spin it away, no way to explain it away. Elena, my mother said desperately, you don't understand the whole situation. But I understood perfectly. For the first time in my life, I understood exactly what was happening and exactly what I needed to do about it. I picked up the phone. Sarah, I'll see you in 4 hours. And Sarah, thank you for telling me the truth. As I hung up, I looked at the people who had raised me, who had fed me lies along with breakfast for 22 years, who had been planning to steal not just my identity, but my future. Now, I said, my voice steady for the first time since this nightmare began, let's talk about those adoption papers you forgot to mention.
The silence following my demand stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. My parents stood frozen in the kitchen, their carefully orchestrated plan unraveling before their eyes. For 22 years, they had controlled the narrative of my life, but in the span of one phone call, that control had evaporated. Elena, my father began, his voice measured but shaky, you're misunderstanding what Sarah told you. Adoption papers can be complicated. Show them to me, I said simply. If I'm legally adopted, if I'm really your daughter, then show me the papers. My mother's hands trembled as she reached for her coffee cup. Elena, this isn't the time for... Actually, Mrs. Chen interrupted, pulling out her cell phone, this is exactly the time. Elena, I've been doing research since last night. I called my nephew. He's a family law attorney in Hartford. He's agreed to drive down here this afternoon. The color drained from my father's face. That's completely unnecessary. This is a family matter. Is it? I asked, moving to the kitchen desk where my father had pulled out the eviction papers earlier. Because if I'm legally adopted, then attempting to evict your own daughter might constitute fraud. And if there's inheritance money involved, I let the implication hang in the air. My mother suddenly seemed to crumble, sinking into her chair. Elena, you don't understand the pressure we've been under, the financial obligations, the expectations. What expectations? The expectation that you'd actually love the child you adopted? The expectation that you'd treat me like a real daughter instead of a business investment? It wasn't supposed to be this complicated, my father said, and for the first time, I heard genuine emotion in his voice. Not love, but something closer to regret. When we adopted you, we were desperate for a child. But over the years, the reality of parenthood, the financial burden, the way you reminded us of everything we couldn't have naturally. So you decided to get rid of me and steal my inheritance in the process? It's not stealing if we're the ones who provided for you all these years, my mother protested weakly. Actually, Mrs. Chen said, reading from her phone, according to my nephew, misrepresenting an adopted child's legal status in order to defraud them of inheritance money is a federal crime. It's called inheritance fraud, and it carries serious prison time. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the same clock that had measured out the minutes of my childhood, marking time until this moment of reckoning. 3 hours later, Sarah Caldwell walked through the front door of the house on Maple Ridge Drive, and I saw my face in hers for the first time. She was petite like me, with the same green eyes and the same stubborn set to her jaw. But where I had spent 22 years feeling uncertain and displaced, she moved with the confidence of someone who had fought hard for everything she had achieved. "Elena," she said, and her voice broke on my name. "My God, you're beautiful." She wasn't followed by lawyers or surrounded by drama. She was just a woman who had driven 12 hours to save a daughter she barely knew from people who had betrayed them both. "Sarah," I said, and the name felt strange on my tongue. Not Mom, because that felt too soon, but not Mrs. Caldwell, because she was more than a stranger now. She pulled a thick folder from her bag. I brought everything: the original adoption papers, correspondence from the lawyer who handled the case, financial records showing the payments your grandparents made to the trust fund, even medical records from when you were born. My parents watched helplessly as Sarah spread documents across their dining room table, the same table where we'd shared thousands of meals in fake family harmony. "Elena," she said, pointing to an official document with raised seals, "this is your adoption decree. According to this, you became Elena Rodriguez on March 15th, when you were 3 months old. You are legally their daughter, with all the rights and protections that status provides." Mrs. Chen's nephew, attorney David Chen, had arrived 30 minutes earlier and was examining the documents with professional precision. "This is straightforward. Elena is legally adopted, which means she cannot be evicted from the family home without just cause. More importantly, these trust documents show she's entitled to substantial inheritance money that becomes accessible when she turns 25. "How substantial?" I asked. $2.4 million plus accumulated interest over the past 15 years. Current value is approximately $3.1 million. I stared at the number, trying to process that my entire life had been built around a lie designed to steal more money than I could even conceptualize. "There's something else," Sarah said quietly, pulling out a letter with my father's letterhead. "Elena, they've been writing to me for years, telling me you were happy and didn't want contact with me. But I saved every letter, and when I read them now, I can see they were designed to keep us apart until you aged out of their care." She handed me a letter dated just 6 months ago. "Sarah, Elena continues to thrive in our family environment. She has expressed that contact with her birth family would be disruptive to her academic focus. We believe it's best to honor her wishes and maintain distance until she's more mature." "I never said that," I whispered. "I asked about you constantly when I was younger. They always told me you didn't want contact with me." "They lied to both of us," Sarah said simply. "They kept us apart so you wouldn't learn the truth about your legal status or your inheritance." My father, who had been silent during this entire revelation, finally spoke. "We gave her everything. Private schools, college tuition, every advantage money could buy. We're not the villains in this story." "You're not the heroes either," Attorney Chen said bluntly. "What you've done constitutes inheritance fraud, elder abuse if the grandparents were deceived about your intentions, and potentially kidnapping if Elena was prevented from contacting her birth mother." "Kidnapping?" my mother gasped. "Preventing an adopted child from accessing their legal birth family through deception and fraud can constitute custodial interference, especially when financial gain is involved." The weight of their crimes was finally settling over my parents. They weren't just bad parents who had gotten tired of their daughter. They were criminals who had spent 2 decades planning to steal my future. "What happens now?" I asked. Attorney Chen looked at me seriously. "That depends on what you want to happen, Elena. You could press criminal charges. You could sue for damages beyond the inheritance money. You could have them arrested today. I looked at my parents, these people who had fed me and housed me and educated me while planning to betray me. They looked smaller now, older, deflated by the collapse of their scheme. Or, I prompted, or you could accept that you've won. You know the truth, you have your inheritance, and you have the legal standing to build whatever life you choose. Sometimes the best revenge is simply succeeding despite the people who tried to destroy you. Sarah reached across the table and took my hand. Elena, I know this is overwhelming. You don't have to make any decisions today about our relationship, about where you want to live, about anything. But you should know that my offer to come to Portland stands, not because of some fake arrangement, but because I would love the chance to know the incredible woman my daughter has become. I looked around the dining room one more time, at the china cabinet filled with wedding gifts my parents had received, at the family photos that documented a lie, at the chandelier under which I had eaten birthday dinners while they counted down the days until they could get rid of me. Then I looked at Sarah, this woman who had driven across the country to save me from people who were supposed to love me. I looked at Mrs. Chen, who had risked her job to protect me. I looked at Attorney Chen, who had dropped his weekend plans to ensure I understood my rights. I want them to transfer my inheritance immediately. I want them to sign documents stating they will never contact me again unless I initiate that contact. And I want them to know that their plan didn't just fail, it backfired completely. How did it backfire? My father asked weakly. I stood up, feeling stronger and more certain than I had ever felt in my life. You raised me to be intelligent, independent, and resilient. You gave me every tool I needed to survive your betrayal. You educated me, you taught me to think critically, you showed me how to solve problems and stand up for myself. In trying to create the perfect temporary daughter, you accidentally created someone capable of beating you at your own game. 3 months later, I was sitting in my own apartment in New Haven, finishing my senior year at Yale with my inheritance safely in my control. Sarah and I spoke every week, building a relationship based on honesty rather than obligation. Mrs. Chen had quit working for my parents and started her own house cleaning business, which I was proud to help fund. My parents had signed every document Attorney Chen put in front of them, desperate to avoid criminal prosecution. They lived quietly in their house on Maple Ridge Drive, their reputations in Millbrook destroyed by the scandal of their attempted fraud. But the most important change was in me. I had learned that survival isn't just about enduring difficult circumstances. It's about refusing to let those circumstances define who you become. My parents had tried to make me small, temporary, disposable. Instead, I had become someone who could fight for herself and win. The glass house they had built around my life had shattered completely, but from its ruins, I had built something stronger, more honest, and entirely my own. And for the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was and exactly where I belonged. Not in someone else's carefully constructed lie, but in the authentic life I was finally free to create. Sometimes the people who try to destroy you end up setting you free. And sometimes the best revenge is simply succeeding despite the people who tried to destroy you.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.